let us delve into His Excellency George Washington's extraordinary and most unexpected life story in part one of a two-part series entitled His Excellency George Washington, Father of His Country. Across the United States of America, 740 schools, a dozen colleges and universities, 26 mountains, 155 towns and counties, various bridges, parks, and forts, the $1 bill, the 25-cent coin, and the nation's very first postage stamps all commemorate His Excellency George Washington. In addition, a colossal sculpture at Mount Rushmore, an entire state, and the national Capitol stand proudly as memorials to the man who served as America's first president. His accomplishments were many and great, but what do we really know about George Washington? George Washington was born in 1732, a fourth-generation Virginian. His father passed away when he was just 11, and his education was modest. The first position he held was as a land surveyor. He quickly had to learn the rugged outdoor skills required to survey the state of Virginia's borders in America's inland wilderness. In 1752, following the death of one of his brothers, George Washington inherited the family estate at Mount Vernon on the banks of the Potomac River. This would be his home for the rest of his life. He also took over his brother's position as major in Virginia's militia, where he began his military career. He was later named Commander-in-Chief of all Virginia's forces. As a leader of men, George Washington would experience both success and defeat. He learned to come out stronger and wiser. Physically, George Washington was a stern-looking man with gray-blue eyes and red hair, which he powdered white in accordance with the fashion of the time. He had a striking figure, being slender and exceptionally tall for the period, standing at 6 feet 2 inches or 1.88 meters tall. Although his tall stature made him an easy target as a devout Anglican, George Washington had a secret power on the battlefield: his unshakable faith in God. In 1755, after miraculously being protected and surviving the conflict, 23-year-old George Washington wrote to his brother John Augustine,
"But by the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectation."
Subsequently, George Washington had established a steadfast reputation as a fearless young soldier. Moreover, it seems that God was preparing him for even greater accomplishments, as suggested by Presbyterian minister Samuel Davies.
I may point out to the public that heroic youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country.
George Washington's courage also fostered a lasting mystique among the indigenous people. A folk belief existed among some North American First Nations that certain warriors enjoyed supernatural protection from death in battle, and this mythic stature was projected onto George Washington. In 1758, George Washington returned to his much-preferred life of a gentleman farmer at Mount Vernon. 1 year later, he married Martha Dandridge Custis, the widow of the wealthy plantation owner. They had a happy marriage, and George Washington raised Martha's 2 surviving children as his own, with much love and care. He had no biological children. Through their union, George Washington became one of Virginia's wealthiest men. During these years, George Washington also began his political career. He was first elected to Virginia's Assembly, the House of Burgesses, where he would serve until 1774, and so he rapidly became part of both the political and social elite in the state of Virginia. America had flourished into 13 states, but was still a British colony. The new taxation program forcing colonies to help pay for war debts had sparked protests. On July 3, 1775, George Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The Continental Congress had unanimously selected him for the position because of his previous experience in the Virginian military and their belief that he could unite the colonies. After being commissioned as Commander-in-Chief, George Washington requested that he does not receive any salary for his service. Amidst the conflict that continued for 8 long and grueling years, George Washington always remembered the vanquished and prayed for an end to the hostilities. After one of many battles, he ordered the next day to be
a day of fasting, prayer, and humiliation, to implore the Lord and giver of all victory, to pardon our manifold sins and wickedness, and that it would please him to bless the Continental Army with his divine favor and protection.
In Boston, George Washington had to face another challenge, smallpox, which had arrived in the city. He himself had been afflicted by the disease as a teenager and knew of its grave dangers. According to historian Ann Becker, George Washington forbade anyone from Boston from entering the military zone and thus prevented a disastrous epidemic among the Continental troops. As the disease spread, he ordered all soldiers to be vaccinated. Historian Elizabeth Fan stated that George Washington's controversial decision is one which must surely rank with the most important decisions of that time. On August 28, 1776, the Americans were nearly surrounded on Long Island. Under George Washington's orders, they tried to cross the East River to Manhattan. It is reported that an unusually thick daytime fog appeared just in time to allow this maneuver to be successful. Colonel Benjamin Talmadge later wrote,
I do not recollect a more fortunate retreat. After all, the providential appearance of the fog saved a part of our army from being captured.
On the night of December 25, 1776, when morale was at its lowest, George Washington embarked with his 5,400 men on boats to cross the half-frozen Delaware River in horrendous weather. The perilous task seemed humanly impossible, but George Washington may have once again benefited from divine help as the crossing was successful. An artistic rendition of the perilous crossing was immortalized in a famous oil painting by Emmanuel Leutz, and another more recent and historically accurate one by Mort Constiller. At the end of 1777, the Continental Army set up camp in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for the duration of winter. They were short of supplies and faced hunger and illness amidst the bitter cold. It is said that George Washington often went into the woods by himself and humbly prayed to God for his country. A number of artists have depicted him at the Valley Forge kneeling in prayer. In one account, the Reverend Nathaniel Randolph Snowden, an ordained Presbyterian minister, wrote in his diary about a story he heard from Isaac Potts.
"There," said he, "lay the army of Washington. It was a most distressing time of your war, and all were for giving up the ship. But that great and good man, in that woods, pointing to a close-in view, I heard a plaintive sound, as of a man at prayer. I tied my horse to a sapling, and went quietly into the woods, and to my astonishment, I saw the great George Washington on his knees, alone, with his sword on one side and his cocked hat on the other. He was at prayer to the God of the armies, beseeching to interpose with his divine aid, as it was ye crisis, and the cause of the country, of humanity, and of the world. Such a prayer I never heard from the lips of man. I left him alone praying. I went home and told my wife. I saw a sight and heard today what I never saw or heard before, and just related to her what I had seen and heard and observed. We never thought a man could be a soldier and a Christian, but if there is one in the world, it is Washington." She also was astonished. We thought it was the cause of God, and America could prevail.
Indeed, under George Washington's staunch leadership, supplies began to come in, training was intensified, and once again, morale rose so the renewed American Continental Man went on. Saintly viewers, it's been a pleasure to have your company today.